Welcome to the Ironcenturion podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood. Tonight, Michael and I are going to be talking about one of his epic adventures where he kayaked from southern Illinois down to the Gulf of Mexico by way of the Mississippi River. So, Michael, how about you tell us a little bit about what are the origins of that trip? Where did it come about? How did it come into being? What were some of your thoughts and processes to get into the water?
Yeah, this truly was an epic life adventure that I'm pretty proud of actually having done and completed. It was 2008, which was the summer after I graduated college. And it had been something that my college roommate and I had been discussing somewhat as a joke or a dream for a while. And as graduation approached, it became more and more and more real and serious, and it happened. And so we did 26 days along the river in a kayak, 850 miles or so from Illinois all the way down to New Orleans, Louisiana. And it was filled with adventures, very Huckleberry Finn style.
I was going to say, this is like the real life Huckleberry Finn adventure right here.
In many ways, it felt like that a lot. And we got referred to that many times. It's interesting because it was special to me because I grew up in Texas, but every year we would travel to Nashville, Tennessee, or to Birmingham, Alabama for Christmas to visit either my mom's parents or my dad's parents. And regardless of which one you're going to, you always have to cross the Mississippi River. And so I remember even as a kid, it was a big deal to cross the river, specifically when we were going to Tennessee, because that was the border. That meant we were finally in the destination state, even though we had several hours left to go on the road trip. And I always, when we crossed the river there's a big grand bridge, mostly at Memphis. There's a big bridge. I would always look down river. And there was this, I just always had this, even since I was like 8 or 9, just this, I wonder what's around that bend in the river, like what's around the corner there. And
not only that, but like I've driven across that, I-20 bridge, right, with the big glass pyramid there, like it's now Bass Pro Shops in Memphis there. But
yes,
we're talking miles, almost at least a mile across that bridge spans. And this is no small creek at that point. Like we're talking a massive river.
Yeah, I mean, it's the largest river in the U.S. And at that place, it is at one of its, I mean, it gets a little bigger as it goes down, but it is quite the event. It's not I-20 though. What is it? I-30, I think.
Maybe it is 30. Yeah.
But yeah, it was a big deal. And so we always made a big deal out of it as a road trip. Coming in, it was exciting. Leaving, it was sad. But that was kind of a key place for me. And I always would look down the river and always wanted to know what was down it. And so when my college roommate was like, okay, I'm doing this, come with me. It just like drove that, I wonder what's around the corner into like full blast. I had always enjoyed spending time on the water and paddling. My dad used to live in Tennessee and had done some whitewater canoeing and instructing there. He and I had gone back and done a couple of whitewater rivers. And so spending time on the water and paddling a boat or a canoe or a kayak was not unfamiliar to me. I had some of the skills and some of the gear already and the love for it. And so when this came along, I spent a while trying to decide if I wanted to do it or not. And I look back now, very glad that I did.
Yeah. So I guess talk through a little bit of the process of like the planning, right? Because that's like the planning side of me. Like, did you just wake up and decide, okay, now we're going to go kayak 850 miles, or what did you have to do to prepare for all this?
Right. So there was some planning, and there was also, and this may be one of the moments in life where I learned a key lesson, because there was some planning, but there was also some just do it.
Yeah.
And I'm glad of that. So it went off with less planning than I would have liked and would have felt comfortable with. In hindsight, that was the right approach. I, as a person, lean to being too detail planned out. And that means sometimes I don't take advantage of stuff that I probably should have done. And this is one of the examples where I did it. I didn't have all the details, and it was awesome. I remember my parents being worried a little bit when I left, just trying to convince them, like, this is what I'm doing. Because here's how I got there. I met my buddy there in Southern Illinois in a little town of Cairo, Illinois. It is spelled Cairo, but it is pronounced Cairo, Illinois. And to get there, I literally loaded up a bunch of river gear and camping gear in a duffel bag with a dry bag inside, put it on a Greyhound bus, and rode a Greyhound bus for like, I don't know, I think it was 2.5 days to get there. And
I mean,
then,
that sounds like an adventure in and of itself.
it was. It was pretty interesting. And I didn't know really exactly how it was all going to work out. The bus didn't actually stop in the town I needed to go to. So my plan was just to try to convince the driver of that leg of the journey to stop on the side of the highway and let me out. I succeeded in that. And so he let me out in the middle of the side of the highway in a place I'd never been. And I hitchhiked the last 2 or 3 miles into town and met my buddy there who said, I'll meet you at the library. And I hadn't talked to him. I mean, this is 2008. So we had cell phones, but coverage was poor. And
Google Maps weren't really a thing.
There was lots of stuff that weren't a thing. So this is weird. It was one of those things that's like a week prior to that, I had said, I'll meet you at the library. He said, great, I'll meet you there too. And we really hadn't talked in like 4 days. And so I just walk into the library in Cairo, Illinois, hoping he's there. So yes, it was planned, but it was the most elaborate thing I'd ever done with the least amount of planning for something of that scale.
It's pretty impressive.
It turned out okay. You know, there were some things that we had some bumps because some things weren't fully planned, but for the most part, it worked out really well because it did have some more of that laid back adventure. Like we're going to go where life takes us as we're going down the river, right?
Did you know how long it was going to take?
Did not know, had a rough estimate, but didn't know how long the journey would totally be. A lot of it was dependent upon water flow. And actually that year, you can go back and look this up, but the Mississippi River was plagued by significant flooding that year. But that flooding was upstream. And so we were making roughly as much progress as the water was. And so these massive floods just stayed hundreds of miles behind us. And we made it all the way down before they became a thing. But it was a lot of family and friends who knew we were somewhere out on the river with limited communication were nervous. And so every so often we'd stop and get emails or get signals so we could text. And that was a common concern. Like, where are you? What are you doing? How is this all logistically working? And that's how it worked is we were pretty remote. We were literally just camping on the shoreline of the river all the way down. We stopped in some cities and had some adventures there, but for the most part, we were just sleeping on the shore of the river in our kayaks. We'd stop for resupplies every 3 to 5 days, and those weren't planned. We didn't have anybody meeting us, a follow team or anything like that. We would just stop, pull over, walk into the nearest town, or hopefully hitchhike into the nearest town and buy groceries and stuff.
That's awesome. So what kind of people did you meet on a trip like this? I feel like with the Greyhound bus and the hitchhiking and, you know, just the river rat mentality, like you must have met some characters.
We met some amazing characters. And I mean amazing as in all of the things that they could be, right? So I learned some things that I just really didn't know about people. Actually, it was a really interesting experience. I think that's one of the biggest parts for me about this is the people that we met. Yes, the river was great and it was significant, but the people we met just all over the scales. I remember we stopped in one small town. I think it was Missouri. And we were walking back from the grocery store and somebody saw us and pulled over and said, "Hey, looks like you guys could use a ride." There was 3 of us. "Looks like you could use a ride." Said, "Yeah, we're going over to the river." So he took us down to the river. He could tell that we had come from the river and we're going back to the river, probably due to dress dirtiness and smell, I would imagine. But he took us over to the river and dropped us off. He walked away and got back in his car as we wandered kind of through the reeds to where we'd hidden our kayaks so they wouldn't get taken on us while we were buying groceries. And as we're loading our boats to leave, it's evening. Our plan was to go down. We didn't like camping right near towns. That was difficult. So we were going to go down 2 or 3 miles and camp. He comes up, running back up and goes, "Hey, you guys still here?" And I said, "Yeah, we are." He said, "Hey, I just checked with my wife. We have 2 boys who are away at college. Would you guys like to come stay at our house tonight?" And we said yes. We tried to say yes to those kind of opportunities as much as we could. Turns
Pets
out,
are nice.
yeah, it turned out it was really nice. It was a nice husband and wife. We stayed in a room that kind of felt a little bit like mine because it was a college age kid that was away at school. Got a shower. That was my first shower in a week or 10 days, I think, at that point. Had a great meal. He was on the city council, I think. So he invited all the city council members over and the mayor, and we sat around on the back porch with the city council of this small town and the mayor while they had there was bourbon and cigars, and we told our story of what we were doing on the river. And it was a really weird. They're all dressed business casual. We've cleaned up a little bit, but we still are pretty dirty and sunburnt, and and they're sitting around listening to our story. And in that moment was a good example of a moment where everybody we met along the river, every man that we met along the river fell into one of two or three common responses that we got. And one of those was, man, I've always wanted to do something like this. I've lived here on this river forever, and I've always wanted to do this, and I just never have. And they would just lean in with this rapt attention to every little boring detail of what we were doing on the river and how we were making it work and what the adventure was like.
And these are men in, their 60s and 70s, right? That you're talking to on this porch, right? Like, this is something that didn't go away in their lives.
Yes, at least in their 50s. Certainly something that just is instantly called them back to that boyish sense of wonder and that sense of wanderlust to just go and explore.
Adventure.
Exactly. And that was one of the most common things we saw as we met people. I remember another person we met him along the river. He was in a big boat, like a pleasure craft ski boat with a bunch of other people that had met at some sandbar. So we come kayaking up, and they're all there on this sandbar having a weekend party. It was probably a Saturday. We lost track of time and days pretty often because they didn't matter.
Oh, yeah.
But I think it was probably a Saturday, and they were all hanging out. And so as we come paddling up, that just freaked everybody out. Because one thing I learned about the river, doesn't matter what state you're in, everybody who lives near it fears it. To them, that river is super dangerous. And I heard this story at least 30 times of somebody who said, when I was a kid, my 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old cousin or my friend's cousin was wading into the water, and the river just grabbed him and pulled him under, and no one ever saw him again. And that story was told to us over and over. Everybody knew somebody's friend or cousin who that had happened to. And so the amount of fear the locals have all along it, from Illinois to New Orleans, continuous fear of the river in small boats. And people would say, I'd never go out there in a kayak or a canoe. I can't believe what you're doing. This is suicide. People would try to talk us out of it, even near the end, right? We've done almost 1,000 miles, and people are like, you just can't go out there. Something bad could happen to you. It's like, we've been doing this a long time now. I don't disrespect the power of water, and I understand it can be dangerous, but like, we got a lot of miles under our belt now, and we know what we're up to here.
You're in an elite group of human beings who have kayaked in that distance.
By that time we were. And so anyway, we pull up that Saturday to this group of boats, and that's the first thing that happens is people start kind of getting intrigued that we're in such small boats. They're in these big jet boats, and they're saying, this is the smallest boat I could ever imagine taking out on this river. And so we ended up staying a day with this guy that had this ski boat and spent the night at his place. And he was all excited and wanted to hear the stories, and said his parents live about, I don't remember how many miles, but for us, he said, my parents live like 2 or 3 more days down the river for you. And so he arranged for us to stay with them when we got there. And so we did one of those things again, where it's like, okay, well, tell your dad in 3 days, we'll meet him at the edge of the bayou that he lives on that meets the river. And so sure enough, 3 days later, we come paddling up to this spot that on the map shows there should be a bayou there, a little swampy area. And there's an old guy sitting there in a fishing boat.
That's awesome.
We follow him like 1.5 miles back up into this bayou, and he and his wife live there. And we stayed with them for 1.5 days, I think. And it was a fascinating experience to see a part of the country that is really hard to access.
Yeah, absolutely. So about how many miles a day were y'all covering?
Well, so when we started out, my roommate actually started a little bit further upriver than I did. So when I joined him, he actually had already been on the river a little bit, and he was acclimatized to it. So I think the first day when I joined, we did something like 10 miles, maybe less. And I was just trying to learn the ropes. And
Had you ever paddled, either in a canoe or a kayak that distance before in a single day?
yes, I had done that distance before, but on a much faster flowing river where it's doing most of the work.
Okay.
The Mississippi has a pretty steady clip to it, but you gotta stay in the channel to do that. And we'll probably talk about this in a minute. There's other traffic on the river that sometimes you got to stay out of their way, and so there seemed to be more work per mile on the Mississippi than other places. Now, if you've paddled on a lake, that's the worst. A lake, especially a lake with a headwind. This wasn't that bad. We would drift with the current and move downstream even without effort. But it did. I did build up some muscle. So by the end, we were doing 50 miles a day. By the
50.
50. Yeah.
Wow.
By the end, those were pushing days, but we did several 50 milers near the very end because we were really eager to get to the next stop point. So the last little bit there in Mississippi and Louisiana, we were pushing some significant miles, which changed my muscle tone changed. I came back from that in the best physical fitness of my life. I remember 3 days after I'd been off the river and gotten home, my arms were just burning. So I went outside to a tree that had a good limb for like chin-ups. I've never been much of a chin-up person. But I remember grabbing onto that limb, and I think I did 12 chin-ups without stopping, maybe 15 without even stopping. I was just like amazed at myself because I'd never done anything like that before. I don't think I'd ever cracked 5. And
that's impressive.
Yeah, I just pumped out 12 or 15 and then dropped to the ground and kind of was like, what was that? And I jumped up and did more because my arms were just aching for the desire to I'd stopped using them. Like my arms had been kind of like my legs for a month. And all of a sudden I just stopped using them and my arms were screaming at me.
That's funny. And then, talk to us about what fueled you for this trip, because that's near and dear to my heart.
There was some motivational fuel, but you may also mean food fuel. Which type of fuel do you mean?
Well, I mean the food fuel.
Okay, that's what I thought. There's some motivation behind it too that's pretty cool, but yes, the food fuel. So I remember this specifically just triggering my mind, and still I remember it very clearly. There was 3 of us. I remember our first day. We started kind of mid-morning-ish because we packed up all the boats, and they kind of gave me a little bit of a tutorial to how stuff worked. And we had to switch around kayaks to make sure, because I hadn't brought mine. I was joining there, and there was one for me. So we switched around to find the best fit. We made it 3 to 5 miles maybe before lunch. And lunch was these thick whole wheat bread, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And so we sat down in a circle, made these really thick, chunky peanut butter with lots of jelly, just these really thick sandwiches, and all ate a sandwich. And I was like, okay, guys, that's great. I'm ready. Let's get back in the boats and we can go. And they said, oh, no, we always make a round. Like everybody makes a round. I was like, yeah, we just all had 3 sandwiches. Like, no. We all make a round. I was like, what do you mean? I was like, I'm full. I said, well, we're starving. So I watched as these 2 guys each made 2 more peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that was like a 1/4 inch of peanut butter and a 1/4 inch of jelly on these big, and they each ate 3 of these things. And I thought, that is insane. What is happening? And then it wasn't a week later before my metabolism had caught up. And so our food looked like this. We would wake up typically pretty early with the sun. So we'd wake up, get going in the day. And so we would do 2 servings of a fast breakfast. So it's typically like instant oatmeal, right? So something really hearty, lots of carbs. So we do 2 normal servings of oatmeal in the morning and then get on the water. And then by about 10, so 2 hours later, 2.5 hours later, we'd stop for a snack. And that would typically be like a can. We do a lot of canned apples, actually. Canned gala apples were really common. And so we'd sit
like the pie filling apples.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. So
right.
we, but without they were canned, but without all it wasn't like pie filling.
Okay.
It was apples you might put in a pie, but yeah, it wasn't pie filling. And so we'd sit in the shade somewhere, or perhaps we'd just stay in our kayaks pretty often and let the current give us a half a mile or so while we ate lunch, or not lunch, pre-lunch, 11
Second breakfast.
second breakfast. So we'd eat that, and then we'd paddle till lunch, which would be about noon, and we'd stop. We'd sit in the shade and get out of the boats and stretch our legs, and that's when we'd all make a round. So you'd eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and then it's your turn. They'd pass all the supplies. You'd make one and pass it around, and so you end up eating 3 of these peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. You get hungry about 2 hours later, and so we would have tuna was pretty common around 2 o'clock, or some type of fish like sardines or kippers or something on crackers or bread. And then we get to camp. So we get to camp about 4:30. We'd find a good, hopefully flat sandbar spot. Sometimes it was a sandbar island. The thing about the Mississippi River is it's so wide and so much volume, it takes a lot of water to raise the water level. So it wasn't too bad for us to stay like on an island, because it would just take so much water to raise it even 6 inches that some places in America, like especially out west, if you don't never put your tent in like a dry wash, because all it's going to do is rain somewhere upstream and you'll be deep in water.
Yeah.
This was hard to do on the Mississippi. So 4:30, we'd stop for dinner and we'd have jobs. One person would be helping stow the boats. One person would be setting up tents and camp gear, and one person would start right away on dinner because we were hungry. And so they'd make a dinner that would be something like red beans and rice, big whole pot of that. And as soon as dinner was ready, all work would stop and we'd sit around the fire and eat dinner. And typically that meant work was only halfway done. So as soon as dinner was over, we would all rotate jobs. And so storing boats and gear, setting up tents and camp. And then the third person would make an entire second dinner, which was often like mac and cheese, something also pretty heavy carbs. Maybe it was like a spaghetti type thing. And then when that was ready, we'd stop work again. Typically work was done by then, and we would all eat that dinner as well. So we were putting down thousands and thousands of calories a day. And I didn't feel excessive. It's crazy.
Oh, yeah.
It was like 4 or 5 times what I eat now.
Yep. Yeah, it was the same when I was going through basic training, where it was just like we were eating 6,000 calorie breakfasts, and then I still ended up losing 17 pounds in 8 weeks. It was insane. So I understand that feeling.
Yes, that is exactly it. That probably sweet spot of intense physical activity.
So in talking to you about this story before, one of my favorite parts is just, and you mentioned it briefly, but there's this part of the adventure that just circles around like the whole fact that nature is dangerous, right? And it is not safe. So tell me about some of the storms that y'all encountered while you were on the river, because those are just some crazy stories just that reminder that we live a very domesticated life where we can sit in a thunderstorm and watch it from our living room and just be like, oh, that's nice. But you were out in some of those.
We were out in some of those and really nowhere to go. You can go to shore, but even then you may be 10, 20, 30 miles away from the next human being at times. We were very isolated. I specifically remember one storm. It was later on the trip where the river had gotten progressively wider. I feel for sure that it was at least a mile wide at this place, which meant you felt very much like you were on a lake. Like you had to sometimes pay attention to make sure you were still going downstream, because you could paddle toward a shore for quite a while if you weren't paying close attention. And so we were out in the middle. The fastest current was in the middle. And it started raining, but it's one of those southern US thunderstorms that is just intense, the inches of rain in a short amount of time. And it was so intense. And we are sitting in a kayak. So I'm probably, my head is 18 to 24 inches above the water. And as the raindrops are hitting the water, it is making a lot of splashing. And so it's actively reducing visibility, both from the rain and from the splashing up from the river. And the noise level is increasing dramatically. And so it gets to the point where we're afraid we're not going to be able to we're going to lose sight of the shore. And so we instantly realize we need to get to shore quickly because we're going to be lost in the middle of the river. And that's not a safe place to be without visibility because of barges, which we'll talk about more here, I'm sure. But so we realized we've got to get out of the middle of the river, and we're going to lose sight of the shore soon. So we start paddling toward the shore. And in that process, the rain continues to increase and continues to increase. And visibility is getting so low that not only can we no longer see the shore, we're starting to lose visibility to each other 10, 30 feet apart. And so we can barely hear each other. We are yelling, trying to stay close enough that we don't become separated and that we make it to shore. And when we get to shore, this spot of shore turns out to not really be a shore, but more of just like a bayou full of cypress trees with cypress knees. And so we pull up under the trees expecting to hit a sandy beach, and there's not one there. It's just like 18 inches of swampy water that is the edge of this river, and it goes really deep. And we start pushing in and realize this just isn't ever going to get out of the water. And so we stop, we get out of our boats, and we huddle under a tree because the temperature was 85 and it's now 60 something, it feels like, and we're cold and wet. We are freezing because it doesn't take much, right? When you're wet and you don't have a lot of gear to
right.
be warm. So I remember us all three huddled very close together, trying to share a little bit of body heat and be able to talk to each other because it's still loud, even though the rain is subdued some under the trees. We're standing under these massive, massive cypress trees and in 18 inches of water. And that's when the lightning starts. And so lightning starts lighting up the sky, which has gotten dark, and starts hitting stuff. And we're like, we have nowhere to go. We're standing under a tree.
You're standing in a swimming pool.
And there's nothing to do about this. This is it. There's nowhere else to go. There's nothing else to do. This is the best we can do in this moment. And that was a intense, memorable part of the journey. Storm ended up passing. It was fine. We warmed back up. It was extremely humid when the sun came out. And there was almost no noticeable increase in water on the river, just because even though there was that much that was dumped, the Mississippi is just so much volume, it doesn't change it.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That is the most intense storm I've ever been out in, still to this day. And maybe it was because of the elements in the moment, and I just knew I couldn't go somewhere. I'm sure there's been other storms that intense, but when you're sitting in your house or in a car, it's just different.
It's not the same. No, yeah. I mean, when you're out in the middle of it and you know there's nothing you can do to get away from it, yeah, that's a whole different kind of feeling. My brother and I hiked through something like that before, where it was so loud we were yelling at the top of our lungs to each other, and we were, right in front and behind of each other on that trail and couldn't hear each other at all.
It was just like that. It was intense.
Yeah, it's one of those moments where you're just like, okay, God, I'm going to need you to kind of keep me safe here because there's literally nothing I can do.
Yep. Well, that was exactly it. I mean, in hindsight, maybe if we'd gone the other way, maybe the other shore was different, but we don't know. And we did the best set of choices we could make. Turned out okay. And so that was it.
So you've mentioned barges before, and I'm sure for most of our listeners right now, they're like, what's the point? People don't encounter barges very often in their day-to-day lives. So enlighten us a little bit for a second here on why that was a big deal on the river.
Yes. So they are not a common crosswalk concern, right? Train crossings are probably the most common referencing thing that we might have. You don't want you get your car stuck on a train crossing and hit by a train, but that's it. So the barges were probably our biggest risk on the river. Everyone was afraid of us getting sucked under or our kayaks getting grabbed and pulled under. That's not likely to occur. But barges were probably our biggest risk, and we were continually watching for them. And the further down we got, the more common they became and the bigger they became because the river was bigger. So we had a radio that would allow us to listen in to air traffic control, barge traffic as ships were working. We'd studied the shipping lane rules so that we knew like what they were going to do, maybe where they were going to try to be, how they would pass other barges, so that we knew kind of what they were operating under. We could use our radio to talk to them, but a barge it's not gonna do anything about us, really. It's kind of like a train.
If they can even see you.
If they could see us. We were so small. compared to them. An 18-foot kayak sounds big, but in a barge, the captain's, the helm of those things, when they would go by, was easily 50, 60 feet off the water. And they would be pushing, it was these big tugboat things, would be pushing multiple flat floating barges loaded. Some would be loaded, some would be unloaded, but they'd be loaded with all this stuff like a freight train, but bigger. And they would have sometimes 8 of those things, 2 by 2, all out in front of their boat. So it could be football fields between them and the front of their craft. There is no way they're going to be able to see us and steer around us. Occasionally they would see us. We'd know because sometimes we'd be listening in on radios. And if they would be talking to each other, sometimes they'd start talking about us. And we freaked them out often. We tried to be, we tried not to be, problematic for them. We try to stay out of the middle of the river, always watching behind us, staying on the sides when we were in their area so that they didn't freak out, because there's nothing they can do, but we don't want to panic them that they're going to, kill some people when they realize that we're not just floating debris.
Right.
They would be huge, just massive barges. One thing we did learn that we could do without freaking them out too much, once they were for sure going past us and we would enjoy this, is we would race to the edges of the barge at the back and jump out of the back into their wake. They would leave 12 to 15 foot swell waves behind them from the power of their motors. That's pushing insane. Them. And we surfing on that was a lot of fun in kayaks. So we would put some effort into that occasionally. Leave enough distance so they don't panic, and then once there's nothing they can do about it and we're too close enough, we would race to try to get next to them and come right along and jump into their wake behind them. And got pretty good at that, and that was a lot of fun. We could catch a little bit of air, especially ones that were going upstream, because they'd be pushing against the current, so the throttles open more. And so the ones going upstream would leave a bigger wake, and that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and thinking of the water speed coming towards you, I mean, you've got a faster closure rate with that wake than you do with the ones going the same direction as you.
Yep,
that's cool.
So that was probably our number one danger. Other dangers were the river was
wildlife.
Yes, that was a potential one, and a lot of people asked about that. Alligators, other, things that you don't want to run into, wild dogs, bears, what else could be out there? We didn't have any run-ins with wildlife at all, other than thousands and thousands of mosquitoes. That was really bad. We thought we might see some crocodiles. We kind of hoped we might, and never did. We did try to camp on islands whenever we could, and that was partially to keep us away from just anything and everything, because we're out in the middle of the river. And so that probably helped some, but we never saw anything bigger than, I don't think I even saw a raccoon, actually, which is really weird. Yeah. So that was not a big danger. The current, though, on the river was the one that people often underestimate the power of water. It doesn't take much running water to swipe a grown man off his feet. And you can see videos of people having that effect in places that flood, their cars getting washed away.
People try to drive through what they think is only a little bit of rushing water. Right.
It's only 12 inches of water. I'll just drive across, and if it's moving fast enough, it'll push you, or who knows if it's pushing a limb or a tree. And we saw one time when like an entire massive 100-year-old oak tree was just floating by with all its root system. And we knew that somewhere upstream that had just been ripped out of the ground by water. And so that was fascinating. The current was dangerous. And as I told you, everybody had a story of somebody's neighbor, or friend, or cousin getting sucked under and never being seen again. We didn't feel that or experience that. We did see, there were signs everywhere, like warning signs. In fact, we've got a photo. In fact, I'll send you this photo. There's a photo of me and the three of us standing under this big sign that says, "Warning, don't go near the river. There's a dangerous current." And those signs were everywhere, all up and down. It didn't matter what state we were in. There's this sign that says, watch out for the current of the river. And it was there. And I'm not trying to downplay the danger of that. Specifically, there would be places where there were dams under the water surface, wing dams that would come out into the river to help keep the channel in the middle so it would stay deep enough for barges. And those could cause some crazy whirlpools. I remember we came upon one place where there was a whirlpool that was probably 5 or 6 feet across, and you could see down into the water. You could see down like 10 feet, just straight into the air down below.
Wow.
And that was kind of weird to be kayaking along. The water level's always right there. It's always
there's
the water
a hole
level.
in the water.
There's just suddenly this like 5 foot by 10 foot hole in the water. So we try to stay away from those. But the current, it wasn't as bad as some people seem to be afraid of it. I think the barges were probably our biggest danger. Probably dehydration and heat stroke were pretty high up there too, but we were very intentional about that.
Yeah, I mean, you went with some guys that were pretty savvy in terms of doing things the right way. So
this was nobody's first time outdoors or first time on the water. Like we'd spent some time doing that, even
though it was a significant leap from your previous exposure to those things.
It was orders of magnitude bigger, but some of the same skills applied.
Yeah. So let's talk about this from the Ironcenturion standpoint, right? Like our whole goal and purpose is, first of all, to draw men closer to the heart of Christ. But we do that in a lot of different ways that are different than the church itself does it. A lot of those are through adventure, and a lot of those are because, you and I share experiences like this in the wild where we love being in creation. We love these adventures, and we love, what being in creation does for our soul. So what would you say to guys that, let's talk first to the guys that are in their 20s or, just about to graduate college or high school that have something like this that they could put on the horizon. What would you say to them?
I almost didn't do this. I got pretty close to not doing it. I felt I needed to be responsible, get a job, move my life forward. And this felt distraction. And I almost didn't do it. And I remember wanting to and talking with my dad about it. My mom was nervous, but I remember talking with my dad about it. And my dad told me something that I still remember. He always has wanted to, as long as I've known him, hike the Appalachian Trail, another cross the country kind of thing, right? I crossed the country north to south by water. He wanted to go south to north on foot from Georgia to Maine, and he didn't do it. He graduated college and already had a job. I don't even think he went to his college graduation because he already had a job and was on to his next thing. He was a state park ranger in Tennessee. And so he was doing that. And I remember telling him, maybe I should get a job and not do this river thing. This is going to take a long time. It took a month, but we didn't know exactly how long it would take. And he told me the story of wanting to, and then wishing he had done the Appalachian Trail, because then there's no easy good time later. Life becomes more full, more complicated. And I know if you're 20, it feels full. It feels like you should be doing something and it feels big, but that's the best moment. That is a good moment. And I'm very glad he gave me that advice, and I'm glad I did that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that goes to others. Yes, you have responsibilities now. Maybe you can't leave your wife. Maybe you can't leave your wife and kids. Maybe you can't leave your family for a month to be gone and do an adventure like this. But this has changed some of the ways I see things, not just even adventures, but we're talking about adventures. I tend to say yes now more. And I think of some of the stuff we've done with Ironcenturion, even. We've gone and helped with multiple hurricane recoveries, and things weren't fully planned out. And there was lots of unknowns. And same principle applies, right? It's a weekend or it's a week. I have lent myself more toward say yes and figure out the details as you go and do the thing. And I have found great benefit from that. I mean, some of those adventures have been with you, Tim. We've climbed some mountains and hiked some things and gone places And that hasn't always been planned out or gone always to plan.
It's never gone to plan, I don't think. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, and you are a pretty meticulous planner. I mean, working with you, I mean, you and I both, I think, are pretty equally yoked in terms of how we like to plan things.
Yeah, you're an engineer in all of
Yep.
the good things and bad things that means.
You have planner in your job title.
I do. It's just like it's what we do. We like to see all of we want the blueprints. I want to know how it's going to work. How many miles are we going on day 14, and at what minute are we going to stop for a water break? Yep. And sometimes it's better to not do it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, an 80% solution is often better than a 100% solution. So,
yes. And I am glad I took the risks, did the thing. And you know, what's amazing is it doesn't seem as risky looking back as it did looking forward. And it doesn't even take that long. Like in the moment, getting on a Greyhound bus, for example, and riding to a town I'd never been and getting off in the middle of nowhere and hoping I can hitchhike to a town where I'm supposed to meet a friend at a library. In hindsight, I was like, yeah, that's fine. That works. And so just do that. And stuff, doors open for you sometimes just because you do things. I remember camping was really hard, specifically as we got closer to towns. And the bigger the town, the harder it was to camp, because if you got too close, there was stuff there and you couldn't really just camp. You'd be in like somebody's backyard, or we'd be seen, and we didn't want to be seen. We wanted to be stealthy. And so Vicksburg was a big town on the river. We wanted to spend a day there, or 2 days there. And that was a hard place to figure out how we were going to camp. Because also, if you're not close enough, you can't get groceries and resupply. What happened for us in Vicksburg, I'm storing the boats and sticking with them because we're kind of in like this, we're really close to town, way closer than we want to be. And so I'm just kind of watching stuff. My buddies go into town and then they come back and say, hey, we found us a place to stay. I'm like, what are you talking about? I said, yeah, we met this person, this lady who owns a building in downtown Vicksburg. She's got an art studio on the bottom where she sells her art, and upstairs in an apartment she lives in. She's going to be going out of town. So she gave us the keys to her car and her apartment and said we could stay there for 3 days while she's gone.
Good grief. Who does that?
I don't know. It was the weirdest thing. I did get to meet her because she came back before we left. But 3 strangers she doesn't know stayed in her place and had use of her car. And so sometimes not having everything planned out is okay, because you get to have really cool stories like that. Every time I'm in Vicksburg, I'm like, cool. Like I stayed in that building.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what about guys that are in our life stage or older? I mean, because this life stage really does play a big part into the accessibility of adventure, right? I mean, now that we're married, some of us have kids. This is not an ideal time, like you mentioned, to just pick up and leave for 26 days. What would you say to those guys that are struggling with maybe some past regret that they didn't do that thing in college that they wanted to try out? Or what would you say to those guys?
Yeah, and that's hard, because I want to be delicate with that, but I know it's real, and I know it's real because every man that I met along the river, and some of the women too, told me this is so awesome, and then they would tell me about their adventure dream that they never did. I don't remember a single story of somebody saying, hey, you're doing awesome. Let me tell you about my dream that I did too. Dozens and dozens of stories of, let me tell you about my dream that I never did, and I'm glad for you guys for doing it. And some guys would get real somber and wistful about it. So I know this is real. I know there's people listening right now that are saying, I wanted to do that thing and I didn't. And so I know that that's hard now. I'm married. I don't think I'd do this now. I wouldn't tell my wife I'm going to be gone for some unknown amount of days, more than 30-ish, probably. I wouldn't do that now. But I think there are ways to still capture some of that adventure. There's ways to do stuff, even on the small scale. For me, it means not planning everything, sometimes taking a trip or a road trip or an adventure and not planning all of the stuff to allow the trip to allow the adventure to happen. Setting it up so it does. And you can do that in a weekend. There's stuff you can do in Texas, because that's where I am, right? The highest point in Texas is Guadalupe Peak. It is a good drive from where I am, the DFW Metroplex, but you can do it in a day. You can drive out there in a day, The next day, you can hike to the very top of Texas, and you can drive back that day. I know
So
because Tim and you and I've done it.
yeah, we've done it, right? And what we left after work on a Friday, and
Yes.
I was back home. Like we went up, hiked the mountain, and I was back home in time to be home for date night on a Saturday evening.
Yes. It was brutal, but we
It
did it.
was, but it was a lot of fun too.
And it's the top of Texas. It's is it 9,000?
8,700 feet.
8,700. Okay, so it's almost. I mean, it's a big deal. It's a serious climb, and it's cool
So
to
at
be able to
some
say
point, I have been the tallest point in Texas.
yes. And I was there, and you were still the tallest point in Texas.
I'm still the tallest point in Texas.
But for a moment, I let you leave from the peak first, just for. But there are ways to, maybe the big adventure that you wanted to do is gone, and you can't do that one now. But I'd say don't let that cause you to miss.
Yeah.
Two wrongs don't make a right. Make all the other adventures happen that you can make happen.
So one big, I think, takeaway for that is communication is key, right? So especially if you're a married guy, my big adventure was serving in the military, right? That was something that I had wanted to do since I was in sixth grade, and had gotten turned down because of my height on multiple occasions until I finally, I remember that feeling of sitting in the office with some of my closest friends, being in Afghanistan, and I was just home, right? Like I'm not where I'm supposed to be right now. Is what I thought and felt. But I was married at the time, right? So, this deferred dream of having been rejected. I mean, it's not like I hadn't tried before on multiple occasions to enter the service, but I had been rejected every time. But there was that deep desire in my heart that my wife and I had to communicate about. And eventually she was just like, yeah, this is something that we should do as a family, and make that decision to pull the trigger, so to speak, to do the thing.
And that required you to be away. So I'm saying maybe you can't leave family for a month, but maybe you can. Maybe you shouldn't, maybe you should. And in your case, Tim, you were away for extended periods of time, at least twice. And that was the right call. And your family, you communicated about it, and your wife supported you through making this thing happen. And
later my kids supported me through, doing those things. So that was very much a family ordeal that we went through. But there's a quote from Eric Davis, who's a former Navy SEAL, that I wanted to share because I think it's really spot on in terms of what we're talking about here. And he says in his book, Raising Men, walking point, or being the first man on patrol, literally the point of the spear, requires levels of alertness that once developed never go away. Similarly, being the point man of your family means that sometimes you will have to go out ahead of them to take time away from them. You're going to have to leave, not to become an absentee father, but to be the knowledgeable and relevant father your son needs. If you're not leading from the front, being the person you want your children to be, then you'll not be able to show them the way. You'll need to be as well as be there, or else the whole thing backfires. And I really think there's a lot of just perception and what's going on in the family dynamic with this quote. So many men just feel like their role as father and husband means that they have to be there in the house. And I would challenge that.
Well, we hear that often when it comes to talking to the men about coming to participate in an Ironcenturion event that is typically a weekend-long event. So it's often a Friday through sometime on Sunday afternoon. And the number one reason men tell us they cannot come is because of needing to be with family. And I agree. There are times you need to be with family. There are 52 weekends in a year, which means while your kid is growing up, there's a measurable number of them before they're grown up and out of the house, and every one counts. But I also reminded of something that my dad has said to me often, or I've heard him say often in the context of teaching children and raising kids, which is when it comes to parenting, from you to them, more is caught than taught. And it's the idea that your kids learn from you by what you teach them, but they learn the most from you by what they catch from you, the things that are never said. You have to be who you want your kids to become. You must be who you want your son to become. And so if you want your son to become a man who is brave and bold and adventurous and does things, he needs to see you do those things when he's a kid. And so sometimes there may be a weekend where it's good for you to be away so that he can look back later and go, oh, my dad did some of these things sometimes. That's okay.
Yeah, I think equally in a marriage, relationship, this doesn't mean that this is one-sided, right? Like, yeah, there's a level of fairness that comes into play here. And, Michael, you do this with your wife and I do this with my wife, and we make sure that they have times that they can go away. I mean, Angela's going to the beach with some friends of hers for a week in September. And that'll be fun for her and for her friends. So yeah, there needs to be this. You can't just look out for yourself as the husband. There needs to be a looking out for your family. So this is a tightrope that you have to walk almost.
It certainly is a tension.
It's super easy to fall to one side or the other, but
because it shouldn't become. I would hope this episode doesn't become an excuse to somebody who's too absent already, who's already chasing their own selfish desires too much. And they go, well, this is just encouragement and motivation that I needed to say that's okay. I can keep doing that. No, you can't. You shouldn't. But there's lots of ways to make that work. My wife does. She'll go on like girls' weekends where she'll, or weeks sometimes where she'll go camping with a group of lifelong friends that she has. There's also times I take adventures and I bring her with me. We do that every couple of years on purpose. We backpacked through Yosemite and I climbed Half Dome and she came with me. So there's things that you can do together. There's things that you can do separately, and it's about this balance and tension. And so I think it goes back to that communication thing.
Yeah. Well, Michael, thanks for sharing your story today. I love hearing the story of what you did. I mean, it's just truly epic to hear 850 miles. That's insane that you paddled with your hands.
The river probably did a good portion of that. But yeah, it was epic. It was a cross. Somebody pointed out at one point, like, you just crossed the country. And I was like, oh, yeah. And what's interesting is kind of midway through, I met a father-son team who was bicycling across the country. Bicycling from the West Coast to the East Coast. And here we are paddling from the North Coast to the South Coast, if you will. And we met in the middle for one day and camped in the same park and shared stories and then never saw them again. And they never saw us again. And it was this neat moment of intersecting adventures. And I thought how cool it is that our lives, this was a father-son team doing this, and here's me and some friends doing this, but just that lives on adventure can intersect in neat, meaningful ways. And it felt bigger and symbolic to kind of have that moment converge. And it makes me wonder what other moments are out there, what places are out there where adventures can converge, friendships can be forged because we're out engaging in stuff that our heart calls us to do, to see what's around the corner in the trail or the bend in the river or over the mountain. Go do those things.
Absolutely. Well, we hope this has encouraged you as our listener to try something new, try something different that might be a little bit outside of your comfort zone. Push yourself into the adventure arena.
Thanks for listening to my story on the Ironcenturion podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Ironcenturion podcast. We're thankful for the support of listeners like you who support this podcast through donations. If you'd like to be a part of our support team, please visit ironcenturion.org/donate. For more information on what it means to be a leader for Christ or how you can get involved, check out ironcenturion.org.